Welcome to Corporate Warrior, the podcast that brings you the best advice on how to improve your health, optimize performance, and maximize productivity. With your host, Lawrence Neal.
Welcome to another episode of Corporate Warrior. Thank you for tuning in again. So today I've just literally got back from Colchester, which is a town in Essex in UK, where I spent the day with personal trainer Ted Harrison, who you may recognize from when I interviewed him earlier on in the year. Ted is a personal trainer who specializes in high intensity training. We had a fantastic workout today. I feel like shit. And I feel also a tad drunk as we followed up that workout with a lot of ale, which probably wasn't the smartest idea. Anyway, moving on. I recently published a new ebook called How to Lose the Last 5 Pounds in Under 3 Weeks, which you may have seen me promoting here, there, and everywhere. This ebook is kind of a amalgamation of all the stuff I've learned from listening to some of the fantastic guests I had on the podcast, as well as a lot of the own research and reading that I do on a regular basis. And it's basically a how-to guide that's combined a lot of the principles that I've learned, as well as my own personal experience, to help people really shed a little bit more body fat if they've had some success but struggling to shed that last bit. Please check that out. There'll be a link on the blog post for the podcast I'm about to introduce. And it's a way that I'm obviously trying to generate a little bit more revenue to actually support the podcast, because it's a huge time commitment, and I'd really appreciate help there. So I recently had the absolute privilege of interviewing Andy Magness, and actually this is one of my favorite interviews to date, because it was very different from the typical interview I do, and I just thought he was a real pleasure to speak to, really. Andy is a rock climber turned adventure racer. So he's one of these crazy individuals that does these crazy races that are over many, many, many miles. So, you know, we're talking 50 miles plus over all sorts of crazy terrain and ridiculous climates. These kinds of races that really test your limits of your person and really push you to the edge way beyond what a marathon would do. So these are, events that a lot of people would think are just kind of stupid because they're, kind of dangerous. But if you listen to this one, you'll really understand why Andy does them, and I respect those that do these kinds of races as long as they're aware of the risks, etc. Andy's a fascinating guy. I won't give you this whole intro now because I'm about to do that in a second when you actually listen to the interview. But the crux of this one is that Andy is his training is high intensity interval training for his adventure races. He doesn't train more than 1 to 3 hours per week. In fact, usually it's an hour a week in total. So it's incredibly minimalist, low volume training approach to what is a ultra endurance type of event that he participates in. That is just a massive testament to this kind of training. A lot of you that I'm sure are aware of Body by Science and the McMaster studies that showed how, a high intensity approach can be better at producing cardiovascular kind of fitness adaptations, as would a higher volume, steady state, regular exercise regime produce. So this is a real testament to that. This guy's fascinating. His book is incredible, which I recommend you all download or buy, because I went through this book in one sitting because it was just brilliant. And it talks all about, it expands all the principles that we discuss on the podcast. So I will say no more. Just that towards the end, connectivity wasn't great, and Andy kind of lost his voice a little bit. I think it's because he's recently participated in an extreme event, and he was pretty ill and still recovering following that event. So you have to kind of excuse that towards the end. But in spite of that, it's still a fantastic interview. So I'm really proud of this one. I hope you enjoy it, and I will talk to you soon. All the best. Okay, so Andy, you are a husband, father, part-time athlete, race director, youth philanthropist, author, and founder of ultramentalbook.com. You participate in adventure races and extreme endurance events, and you consistently finish in an impressive position despite training only 1 to 3 hours per week. Andy Magness, welcome to Corporate Warrior.
Thank you. Great to be part of it, Lawrence.
Cool. I'd be really, I suppose, set the scene and give the listeners a bit more context. I know a bit about your story because I've seen your website and I've read some of your book. But can you just tell us how kind of your story started and how it changed when you, I guess, became a little bit more educated about exercise and your schedule suddenly become a lot busier, that you had to change the way you approached exercise and train for these events? Could you kind of explain that journey?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I pretty much started like most people do when you get into endurance sports. I actually kind of got into longer distance running because my wife was a runner. So before we were married, I was trying to, keep up with her and impress her. So I did a half marathon, and I'd never really run before that. But I kind of got the bug. And I did just what everybody else does when they're looking for longer and longer events. I trained pretty traditionally. I was putting in big weeks. In particular, I think in 2003, I did a full off-road Ironman in Park City, Utah. And, I remember there were some weeks I was doing 12, 15-hour training weeks. And then I got into adventure racing after that. And I was living in New Zealand at the time. We'd come over, my wife and I had moved over to New Zealand. And I got an invite to Primal Quest, which was a big 10-day adventure race in the States. It was a top adventure race that year. And, I trained, I prioritized the training. And unfortunately, that didn't work with, the rest of my life. I had an infant son, and I was living in a new country, and, my wife didn't really know anybody. And by prioritizing the training, it really caused a lot of difficulty in terms of my relationship with my wife in particular. And so after that race, I had a lot of time to think because I got pretty ill. It was a pretty tough race. So I was kind of laid out on the couch for 3 weeks, and I was trying to figure out what I was going to do. And I realized that I wasn't interested in giving up the racing. I just got so much out of it. I really liked suffering over these long distances, and all the highs and lows. And some people, the people that do these kind of races, they get it, right? But so it was meaningful to me, but I knew that it wasn't worth what my present course was going to have it cost. And so I actually stumbled onto a program. Well, first I just decided, I said, I'm going to limit my training to 3 hours a week. That's it. I'm just going to, I'm going to do whatever I can in 3 hours a week and see where I get. And I stumbled onto a training program called FIRST, which is the Furman Institute of Science, Running, and Technology, I think. Just a Runner's World. I found it on Runner's World, and I modified it. So I didn't use the program because it was for running specifically. So I modified it for my style of stuff. I did biking, running, and paddling on this 3 hour a week chunk. And that's really roughly what it took. Sometimes it's a little less, sometimes a little more. And what I found was that I got fitter fairly quickly than I had ever been before, and significantly so. And it was just, I got faster on the run, on the bike, on everything. And I was more engaged in training and really excited about it. And I would go and race. I have a twin brother, which is kind of a unique crucible for testing this sort of thing. Yeah. And he was doing more traditional training. He was putting in 10 and 15-hour weeks. He wanted to be a professional adventure racer. And I would travel and to the States point, and I would go and race with him a couple times a year. And what I found was that I was as fast, if not faster than he was. And so I pretty much figured I was onto something. And it progressed from there, right? So it progressed, and as I got more into it, and then I started researching training methods, and I looked more into high-intensity training. And as I started exploring like true high-intensity training, I realized, man, there's just no way I can do this for 3 hours a week. I mean, it's pretty much, when you're going all out, you got 5 minutes, maybe a few more than that in a session. And so I started playing around with those type of intensities, and kind of never looked back,
Excellent. That's awesome. I absolutely loved your book. I found it, and I've wrote the words that came to mind as I was reading it, which is that it's hilarious. You're really authentic and transparent in the book. This is your ultra mental book that you sent me. And it's really well written, and it's practical. And I just think that people who want to get into kind of extreme endurance and adventure racing and want to know how to train for that, I just think it's a great kind of primer for that. Absolutely. So I've got some questions about the book that I just wanted to ask you.
Sure.
So I liked how you reinforced that much of the mental training is provided by doing hard things. I think that was very kind of Doug McGuff-esque. I don't know if you stole that from him or whether that was your own.
No, yeah.
And actually, you mentioned how partaking in the events themselves gives you that experience. So the kind of that mental training is kind of developed over time. And you give some great practical advice on how to improve mindset towards endurance events, in particular with the reference to the central governor. Are there any mental exercises that you recommend as perhaps an 80-20, so Pareto law, towards mindset development, like the most effective things you can do?
Well, it's interesting because I have dabbled in training other people using kind of these methods, the high intensity methods, and with an eye towards, doing endurance events, friends that have professed the desire to do this sort of stuff and then not been able to devote the traditional training hours. And I don't know that I have an easy answer there, because mentally I think, on the one hand, I'm lucky because my background, and you didn't mention this, so I'll mention it briefly, but my background before I got into endurance racing was in climbing. And I wasn't really fit because of that. I did get myself into a heap of situations that were significantly uncomfortable and where there wasn't an out. I mean, the only out was me. And so as a result, by the time I made my first forays into these really, big 24-hour and longer events, I already knew that when it came down to it, I was capable of hitting a low that many people, not most, but many people would, the first time they experience, they're just out. This is not worth it anymore, and bounce back from that, right? And so I think that the only thing I can say, and I think I talk about this in the book, is this idea of the best teacher is experience. So you have to, training will only get you so far. You can train effectively for something a marathon distance, because there's the last 6 miles that they talk about being really mental, but you've only got 6 miles, so you don't have that big of a hurdle to overcome. But if you're doing something, like the Badwater ultra marathon, where it's going to take most people, 36 hours, when you're at your first low after 8 hours, right? Because the lows are so difficult, because if you've never experienced that before, you're done. Like mentally, you're checking out and you're coming up with all the excuses you can possibly come up with to quit. So a couple things that I would suggest, if somebody's really keen to develop the mental aspects, don't race initially. Say, I'm going to go and I'm going to conquer an 80K training run. And go out in the mountains and do it, where there's not anybody at an aid station that's saying, oh, you can just hang out here and we'll have the sweeper come and pick you up if you're done, and all that kind of stuff. I mean, I contribute a lot of my own mental strength to the of many of these climbing trips where there wasn't an out other than to walk with a 40 kilogram pack over 2 mountain passes when I'm already exhausted and I don't have any food, and all of that sort of stuff. So by the time I got to adventure racing, hunger, sleep deprivation, cold, heat, all those sorts of things, the adapting to those sorts of things was already in my wheelhouse. And I had this positive reinforcement, because by pushing through that, I had success in all these big endeavors that I was going for. And that was this positive reinforcement, overcome these mental challenges, and it gave me the confidence to keep doing that. So I think I talk about the 3 elements that I kind of identified for me: confidence, a knowledge of suffering, and then a strong will. It's to the extent that you can develop those, I think it pays huge dividends, as much as any physical training does, in terms of what you're able to accomplish on whatever fitness you're able to reach, on whatever training you're able to put in.
Do you think, how much of the will side of things do you think is kind of just genetically hardwired? Like some people have it and some people don't.
That's a great question. I've pondered that quite a bit, and I think that there is a fair bit of it that's hardwired. I absolutely do. I think that you can have a coach, or you can have somebody that pushes you and helps you develop a bit more will. But outside of that, just the personal will, if you're going to go out and do this stuff on your own, day in and day out, week in and week out, I think you're probably right, because a lot of the people that I have given programs and even trained for a period, it's hard to stick with it, because it is, high intensity training is anything but comfortable, right? It's really uncomfortable, and you have to really believe in the payoff and want to invest a very small amount of time to have a really efficient workout. So, but I agree. I think that there's quite a bit of it that is probably hardwired.
Yeah. I noticed a lot of the workouts in the book were done on treadmills and stationary bikes. Does it matter that these types of tools aren't specific to the events, like running or cycling outdoors would be? Or do you find you still get the adaptations that improve your performance in any case?
Well, typically, like if I'm training for, let's say a 50-mile run or something like that, then my highest intensity efforts, I tended to be inside on the treadmill. Or occasionally, when I had access to an indoor track, I would use an indoor track quite a bit, because it was nicer than a treadmill. You weren't limited. You didn't feel like you're running in place, but still, you didn't have the environmental factors that you would have outside. I tend to, if I was training for a race like that, I would probably be going outside for a tempo run, maybe once a week. And then as the race got closer, I would probably put in, an hour and a half, not maybe a 90-minute tempo run. And again, I don't really ever do long, slow distance type stuff. So it's all hard out. If I'm doing a 90-minute run, it's basically like race pace. It's like I'm racing a half marathon, and then give myself enough time to recover. But for the high intensity stuff, I have found that I invariably, without question, have a better workout if I eliminate environmental factors. And the easiest way to do that, if you have access to a gym, is to use equipment in an indoor facility.
Interesting. Right, okay. Because I was just thinking about the treadmill. I'm not an expert on like running gates and stuff like that, but my understanding is that running on treadmill is not perfectly akin to running outside, because it misses part of it. Isn't it pushing off the ground or something? The treadmill misses an aspect of that. So it's not as specific. I understand that why you do it, but it's just a question I have for you on that particularly.
Yeah, I have actually looked that up. My wife and I have a long-standing argument about that, the mechanics of it. And, it's interesting because the research that I've done, it comes in on both sides. Like I will, you get a lot of fitness people who say, "Oh, it's different," right? But then because I'm a physicist, so I also, I have a master's in physics. I don't use it now, but when I found research articles from physicists that are looking at the actual physical mechanics, they're saying, "Look, this is not different than." So the one argument that I found that does suggest, obviously you don't have an apparent win, but that's obviously one of the reasons I do it inside, because you're controlling that. The gait, I do think, depending upon your treadmill, because you have a confined space. I did read some research that says that a lot of people will change their stride because they feel like psychologically they feel they're in this confined space. And so their stride will not, when they're running on a treadmill, will not be the same stride that they would use running outside. I haven't actually noticed a difference personally. I adopted kind of a high cadence running style, a decade ago, and so I have a pretty short stride length and a high turnover. 98 to 100 kind of turnover cadence, and so I actually haven't found much of a difference. I also am running on pretty high quality treadmills, I suppose. Because I have noticed when I run on less high quality treadmills.
You can say shitty, by the way, if you wanted to say shitty.
Okay, shit, yeah, all right. Just wanted to show, right? Yeah. So when I run on equipment that's not as good, I won't do it, because you're right. If my stride feels awkward, then so for me it works, and certainly if I don't have a treadmill, like there's been periods where I haven't been a member of a gym, then I'll try to favor track workouts. Cool. Just because there's fewer variables, you're going in a circle, so you're not always facing a headwind, kind of a thing. And I have good workouts outside too. I feel at the end of 5 or 10 minutes in the gym, I always have felt I'm approaching that that 100%, I'm actually approaching failure. Granted, it's really hard to approach failure on a treadmill, because when you fail on a treadmill, the consequences are, not great. Yeah. But the other thing about a treadmill that I like is that in terms of the central governor, when I'm having a big effort on a treadmill, I can hang on longer, because when I start to get tired and when I start to get fatigued, for example, if I'm doing a half an hour on a treadmill or something, and I'm doing it at a high level, all I have to do is hang on and not hit the button to slow down. Yeah. And so I actually push a little bit harder than, whereas if I don't have you don't have to look at your watch all the time to check out your pace. And I just have had, for me it works. And again, that's one of the things I hear the most is people hate running on treadmills, right? A lot of people just say, I like your ideas, but man, I could never run on a treadmill. And you can do the stuff outside too, but personally, I found it's been most efficient for me. And it's also easiest for me to separate the workout and to get in the mind space when I go to the gym, sometimes to bring the mental will that I need to go through a big effort. So
cool. I liked a lot of your book, but I liked how you placed a lot of emphasis on the importance of form. You just mentioned it there about your running cadence to optimize efficiency and performance. And I do think it's really important that any part-time athlete should be spending time perfecting their form. Like you say, it's not sexy, but it's what is essential for best results. Right. Which is relevant to what you just said. But I obviously I've got a question from a listener, but I just wanted to ask you: Have you? I'm assuming you've probably read Body by Science by Doug McGuff. Have you? You read that one?
I have read parts of it, and I have used his strength training principles. I don't know if you got a chance to look at the guide, but basically what I've been doing for a while in terms of strength has been something based upon what he does. Yeah.
Okay, well, we'll come on to that a bit later. But so obviously, well, in that book, which is one of probably my favorite health and fitness book ever written, in my opinion, he talks about the study that was done at McMaster University, which I'm sure you're aware of, which is the one that showed that you can improve cardiovascular fitness by doing high intensity, 10-minute whatever it is sessions once a week, and it's as good if not better than doing an hour a day or whatever,
right, steady state stuff.
Steady state stuff, exactly. So one of my listeners, Nick Douglas, he asked, how do you train your CV system to last a full ultra distance if you don't train that long per week? So how is it you're able to achieve that? Like, how does that work?
Well, I'm not exactly sure how it works. I have some theories. So, one is that in an ultra distance event, right, your overall pace is, and I've experienced this because I've raced. The longest race I've done is 10 days. It took about 9.5 days, but wow. Is that you're training intensely, and that's improving your fitness. You're gaining mitochondria in your cells. You're becoming more efficient at processing energy. Okay. And the way I look at it is I can go without training at all, and I can put in 50 miles. So I know this about myself, that my human body is capable of going out and doing that. Right now, without, I could get out of the car and I could go run 50 miles. My time will improve the more dedicated training I do towards that end. So it's not a matter of cardiovascular fitness. The cardiovascular fitness I have has been built from other races and all of those sorts of things, and is maintained by dedicated high-intensity training. But again, it's mental. So one of the issues that, and I talk about, or I try to talk about a little bit when I'm writing on the subject now, is that there's this idea that that specific preparation is necessary, and sometimes I think that can become an Achilles heel, because I will see people who train for, say, a marathon following a program, and then when it gets hard, they think, oh shit, I didn't train enough, or I shouldn't have missed those days or whatever, because there's an expectation that we train so that it's easy, right? An ultra marathon is never going to be easy. Or if it is easy, you should be going harder, right? You should be running faster. It's going to destroy you. And so what I have, this both love for being destroyed, when I do these events. And I have this understanding about what that means, how I'm going to respond, and that I am going to want to quit, and I'm going to have all these thoughts, but I have enough experience to know how to push past that and not give in and those sorts of things. And my cardiovascular system has always been just fine. I mean, to be quite honest, when I'm doing the old man shuffle, I did a couple years ago, I did a lap style trail run where it was a 10K lap, and we just did as many laps in 12 hours as we could. And, the 6th and 7th laps were just awful because I'd only been training an hour a week. So I was experimenting with real low volume training. And the 6th and 7th laps were awful, but I didn't quit. I never really felt like quitting. I just set small goals. And again, it's all about the mental stuff. Every mile marker, I'd stop and have a drink of water or something like that. And I put it in a context that I knew that I could maintain because, my thought, the way I like to say is if you were out in the middle of the wilderness and you'd been running and not everybody, that comes back to some people have the will, some people don't. But for me, I never reach a point where I cannot go any farther. And, I talk to people who are doing races and I say, look, who drop out, they drop out. I did a 135-mile winter bike race at one point, and a lot of people dropped out. And I know that if the point at which they dropped out, if the finish line would have been 5 minutes down the road or 5 miles down the road, they wouldn't have dropped out, right? So they have this mental idea, I have reached the limits of my fatigue. I can go no further. But it's clearly not true. It's like what Noakes talks about, where they've done the studies and they've had marathon runners or they've had people run to fatigue on a treadmill, and then they've measured the muscle glycogen and they actually still have had energy in their muscles, right? So there's a perception of fatigue, a perception of incapacity that is not actually part of reality. It's hard for a lot of people to swallow simply because there's. Have you heard of Radiolab? You probably haven't. It's a U.S. show on NPR, but they did a great piece on Noakes and fatigue, and the guys are joking about how people don't want to hear this because it basically keeps them on the hook for when they feel like they can't go any further. That's their head. It's not when they want to throw in the towel and say I'm done. I've done everything I can. Right? It's only true to the extent that they're unable to win that debate with the central governor and keep going. Obviously there's a point at which you actually reach the failure. Your heart would fail, and occasionally, that happens in very rare circumstances. But my thought and experience, and I think what Noakes would agree with, is that the default stopgap measures that your body uses in terms of fatigue happen, well before you actually reach those danger levels.
Right. Okay. I noticed in the book you didn't have any, more, body by science type high intensity strength training protocols with resistance machines. And it was all kind of high intensity interval training. And I suppose that the reader's goal is to perform well at races. That's kind of the objective. With a low volume approach, not to, I suppose, build optimal health. You might disagree with that, but that's kind of my interpretation. So it was, I suppose, a slight concern of mine that, how is it that you're able to, and perhaps this isn't the goal, but able to kind of like ensure that you are preserving or building muscle tissue? Because surely your sessions are going to kind of potentially cause the body to actually lose muscle. So how do you get around that? Does that make sense?
Well, it does. It does. Since the book was written, my present training has gone even to a little bit lower volume training, and many of my workouts now are in the 5 and 10 minute range, and they are so demanding that for example, if I'm on the stationary bike, I'll do 5 30-second intervals, and at a sufficiently hard enough level where when I'm done, I have definitely triggered the mechanism to build muscle. In fact, since I've gone to this super high intensity training, my muscle mass has increased on my legs significantly over the last couple of years. What I don't talk about in the book is that I have always, before I talk a little bit about my beginning with weight training, and so I have honestly never let go of that. I now use a high intensity approach to weight training. It's more body weight focused, but that would be something to add in for a second edition for sure, because I agree that is important. And because it's been such a part of my background for decades, beyond what I was when I was starting to get into high intensity training, I didn't really focus on it in the book, but I always have had a pretty high level of fitness. With climbing, especially, I was training so that I could do a 1-arm pull up.
Yeah.
I never got it with my right arm. I only got it with my left arm. But and I was doing chin ups and dips with 90 pounds hanging from my waist, and so I've always been really keen to be strong. Now it's shifted less to a focus on absolute weight and more of a focus on a McGuff style, slow reps. Like I do what he does in the Body by Science Big 5 workout, which you're familiar with, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so I do something similar. For me, I'm mainly doing it just with I have a little 2, which I took instead of the Big 5, a little 2, where I'll just do a set of chins and a set of push-ups, but I do the 10-second reps and as many as I can, and I see progress that way. For me, it's about maintenance, because I've already got a pretty strong weight, strength to weight ratio, which I'm trying to maintain. And I think that's important. I think that my training benefits. I also do a lot of paddling and rowing and things like that for my high intensity, which when you do that stuff at real high intensity, you are developing quite a bit of strength as well. Yeah. So the tempo stuff I talk about, that I agree. I think if your focus is on tempo style runs, then you're not necessarily building the strength that is important. So, but with real high intensity stuff, track intervals, tire drag, some of that kind of stuff, I do think you build the strength.
That's really interesting, because there's actually a few studies that have come out by guys, James Steele and James Fisher, who are guys who are scientists down in the UK in Southampton, and they've been talking about how actually you can stimulate strength and hypertrophy by doing high intensity interval training, very, very low resistance, just as much as doing high intensity strength training where it's like, 2-minute sets. Like,
right.
The weight is almost, the weight doesn't really matter. It's just much more, it's obviously the former is much less enjoyable, if that makes sense,
right.
Because you're taking longer to get to failure. But I found it interesting that, it really doesn't make massive difference. Obviously, your genetics will really determine to what extent you hypertrophy and gain strength.
And that's it's the idea that, like you just said, about reaching failure, right? So what McGuff talks about is, he says, this is a quick way to reach failure. And once you reach failure, you want to get out. That's it. You're done, right? Because you're not going to receive any sort of benefit to going beyond failure or doing more sets or things like that. And I think that some high intensity work on the bike or whatever can actually. I'm a big fan of the elliptical, which I know seems weird. I used to think the elliptical was kind of for people that didn't want to work hard. But I have I put 5-minute sets on the elliptical, and I actually reach failure, and I'm in agony for 10 minutes afterwards, because the lactic acid or I know lactic acid isn't real anymore. That's what the science says, but it hurts. Whatever it is, it really hurts. So yeah.
Have you ever, just out of interest, experimented comparing the kind of strength and hypertrophy results you get from high intensity interval training versus strength training? Have you noticed any difference, or is it the same? Have you ever done that experiment of comparison?
I have not. Mainly the what I have found since I started doing high intensity training, that I don't really do a lot of strength training for my legs, honestly, and it's mainly because the sessions that I do on the bike, I have seen an increase in, I've seen definite muscle hypertrophy, and the high intensity runs, a lot of times I do it on inclines, and same with my calves, and so I feel pretty good. And obviously that's pretty much based on looking in the mirror occasionally, right? But there's something to that. You can tell. I mean, that's how most people measure hypertrophy or height. Look in the mirror and check out their guns and stuff. So, so I haven't really. I could obviously do the experiment, especially with the rowing, the rowing and the elliptical, because those are hitting those muscle groups that I also hit with the push-ups and the chin-ups. But honestly, for me, I'm pretty happy with my strength. And so for me, the strength aspect of it is more about maintaining.
Yeah.
Because I certainly could be, and I used to be really into weightlifting, and I used to be a lot stronger than I am now. But I do 20 chin-ups in perfect form, and that's a pretty decent number, and so I'm happy with that. And I always want to be able to do that as I age, But so the benefits to increasing beyond that amount aren't benefits that right now I'm seeking, essentially.
Cool. Okay. Yeah, and that's interesting. I guess I don't know what you think about this, but I know that any of the high intensity training kind of evangelists that listen to this will be thinking, oh yeah, but the downsides to trying to. But again, we're not necessarily talking about health as being the objective. It's race performance. So, but they also say the downsides of doing the type of training you advocate in the book is that it's the motion stress. Yes, you're reaching failure. Yes, you're stimulating hypertrophy and strength, but the downside is the motion stress, which obviously is pretty much eliminated in a super slow strength training form.
My motion.
Oh, what I mean is just the because you are, well, you're really testing me now, but if you're on a treadmill and you're doing high intensity, you are doing so many, your joints and you're rotating so much, and you're just doing more work, if that makes sense. You're doing more joint work, more impact, versus a super slow chest press where there's pretty much no force because you're moving so slowly, and it's short, obviously. Does that make sense? Yeah,
it does. And what's interesting is that I've had more discussions, after I put this book out there, because it is focusing on training for endurance. The flip side of the coin is I get a lot of criticism from the endurance people saying there's not enough joint stress. Like, where are you going to get the durability that you're only going to get by running, 60, 80 miles a week? You're not going to get it. And so it is, I recognize very keenly that the position I hold is very much a no man's land. Right, so I'm using high intensity training protocol, which I really believe in. Train for events that most people that do endurance just think that high intensity training has no place. That you need to go out and run 60 miles a week and put in 12 to 15 hours a week, and that's the only way you're going to be able to get there. So I can see where I would get those questions where the high intensity folks are saying, hey, you're doing too much. But you're right, and to be completely blunt, the type of events that I like to do are terrible for your body, right? If you do them too much, I mean, you can't. And I try to tell people this when they're training for for a big event, is that you can't run 50 miles without breaking your body. You just can't do it. You can't. There's so much repetitive stress, and you can't train for it. If you try to train up to the length of your race, you're going to be chronically injured, right? So the way I approach it is to try to peak my fitness with as little time as possible. And again, like the high intensity training, running, for example, it puts a lot more joint stress, but it puts a hell of a lot less joint stress than anybody that would follow a traditional program would,
Absolutely.
right? When I'm running an hour, or when my training is an hour a week, and let's say 50 minutes of that is cardio work, that is a tremendously small amount compared to what most programs suggest. And as a result, what I have found is that I have been largely injury-free. Occasionally I get injured during an event, but it's a self-limiting thing. It's, like you get an IT pain or my knees will get swollen. But again, that's to be expected. And my thought is that it's better to get to the start line healthy and know I'm going to have these self-limiting conditions. And when I rest, I'll heal, because I've never actually had an injury during a race where I haven't healed. Because, it's repetitive stress. It's a repetitive stress injury. And like all repetitive stress injuries, it's not like something where you're doing the wrong move, playing soccer or something like that, and there's a pop, right? You're just going through the motion, the tendon's rubbing over the bone, eventually it gets inflamed, and you have to deal with pain. Take some ibuprofen. After the race, put your feet up for 3 weeks, let everything go back to normal, and then get back to it. But so yeah, it's no man's land for sure. Yeah,
it's I love it. You must get so much criticism, but for the right reasons. And no, I think you're spot on. I think that's great. No, I highlight that. In fact, you just answered my next question, which is I found it really interesting how you got no acute injuries from the training aspect, and that makes complete sense to me because it's a very smart way of training, and obviously you're going to get that. You're only going to get those kind of those short-term injuries, as you put it, during the actual events themselves. How is? I've got another question here from a listener. I'm going to probably butcher his name here. I'm going to do my best to pronounce it. Haydar Al Hakim. How he asks, what advice do you have to efficiently recover from extreme sports quickly? So I guess, once you've done one of your races, how do you recover really adequately?
Well, I'm not sure if I can answer how to recover. I prefer to just take rest, hang out with my family. Yeah. But one of the things that I am very careful about is knowing when I've recovered. And one of the ways I do that is I use what are called baseline workouts. So during my training, I will have a couple workouts that are either on the treadmill or on a stationary bike that I have a baseline level that I consider, from keeping logs of my training. All right, this is where I'm going to start. So when I finish a race, after a week, I'll go back to the gym and I'll say, all right, I'm going to try my bottom level bike. If I can't do it, I take another week off. So I don't try to push through, right? Because most of my training is really high intensity work. You can't do it unless you're recovered. And so it gives me a pretty good barometer of whether I'm recovered or not. Because so I don't waste my time training if I'm not ready to train. And this is obviously particular to the kind of training I'm doing. I'll still go for walks or go for a hike or a bike ride with the family or whatever like that. But I recognize, and it's really easy to recognize, that you're still not recovered when you go and you try to match a performance that you're able to do when you felt really great. And oftentimes I'll feel really great, and I've taken a week off, and I'll be itching to get back, and I'll be like, oh man, I'm ready to go. The DOMS has gone down. I'm not sore anymore. And I'll get in there and I'll try to match one of those baselines, and I'll be like, I'll make the first 2 out of 6 intervals or something, and then I'll just be like, I don't have it, and then I need time. My system's not completely recovered.
Cool. So. That's a great kind of barometer for recovery, I think. Hypothetically speaking, if you had, because I appreciate that the way you train now is, I think, partly driven by obviously your change in lifestyle, but also I think because of your kind of personal education. But if you had all the time in the world back again to allocate to training, what would you change about your regime, if anything?
Honestly, you're right. I don't know that I would change as much. I have developed a strange satisfaction out of the workouts that I do that are just pretty brutal, and a strange satisfaction about being able to maintain the level of fitness I can without the time investment. And it has been pretty good in pursuing other interests. I'm doing a fair bit of writing now. I probably, if I had all the time in the world, would do more races, I guess, or do more. Sometimes it's not even races. I call them missions. I'll decide to run a 80K track just because I want to see what it's like if I can get through it in a day. So I think that's what I'd do. Probably if I had all the time in the world, I would still, maybe I would train a couple hours a week instead of what I'm doing now, which is less than an hour a week. But I still think that I would give that time to my family and to other interests, so that then if I had that more time, I'd make sure all the other aspects of my life were being paid attention to and were flourishing as well. And then I would I'd take a little bit of time for more missions and stuff. I think that the training is an important part of my life in the sense that I hate to miss workouts, but it's a very small time commitment, and it works for me. So I don't know that I'd change anything knowing what I know now.
Cool. I like the way you address diet in the book, because you mentioned obviously there's so many different camps out there, and you gave a nice summary that basically said fast on occasion, don't eat a ton of junk food, eat lots of fruit and veg, and some red meat on occasion. A few months back, I interviewed Ben Greenfield. Are you familiar with him?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep, I am.
a fascinating guy, and he obviously, as you probably know, he's a big advocate of high fat, low carb, and the benefits of utilizing body fat for or ingested fat as ketone fuel versus conventional carb loading. Right. I noticed that is not what you advocate in the book. Have you tried that approach, and what are your thoughts on high fat, low carb for endurance?
I have not tried that approach. I have the last actual couple months. I have been going round and round about this nutrition debate. It's not really a debate, but online about the best way to fuel fitness, endurance, all that kind of stuff. And I think that I wrote a blog post once that I think the title was "It's Never Easy. It All Works." And so when it comes to diet, like you have guys like Rich Roll, right? Have you heard of Rich Roll?
I've heard of him, but I don't know much about him.
So he's this guy that lost 100 pounds and started running ultramarathons. He's big in the States. He's got the level of fame that Ben Greenfield does in the States. And he's a vegan. So he's completely the opposite. And you got guys like Matt Fitzpatrick and these other guys who are big vegan ultra runners, and they're all about, hey, it's not high fat, low carb. It's vegan. Right. And then you've got Ben Greenfield and guys like Dave Asprey and all these other biohackers that are all just butter and so I think I think that so much wisdom. You've heard of the Pareto principle, right? The 80-20?
Yep.
Yeah. So I think that this just applies. I've found so much use for application for this kind of little rule. And for me, 80% of your nutrition health comes from 20% of the dogma, right? And what is the 20% of the dogma that makes the most sense? That Ben, that all these guys, right? They all eat processed simple sugars, right? Mm-hmm. And so they all say, eat less of the crap, eat more vegetables, and they disagree on some stuff. Certainly, high fat, fats are healthy, right? I'm not against fat at all, and I think that it can work. Like, I think what Ben does probably works for him, and it works really well. But clearly, what Rich does works for him, right? And he's eating a whole bunch of kale, and he's never touching bacon and all this kind of stuff, right? Mm-hmm. So I just have this real sense, and honestly, there's so much misinformation in terms of not only training but also nutrition. That there is real science behind it, but honestly, the science is pretty weak science, because it's there's these studies that are done with 20 people or 25 people, and as a trained scientist, I look at these studies and the reports that get written about them, and then I look at the conclusions that are drawn, these massive diets that are constructed around a science that is not actually in support of this massive diet. And I just think it's not that these things are bad, right? It's not that Ben's solution wouldn't offer somebody who was overweight or who was trying to get fitter, a good way of going about it, any more than Rich Roll, because all of these things are going to take somebody down on a path that is going to overcome, the bad eating habits that they have.
Yeah.
So I haven't had, and I've done quite a bit of research over the last couple months, and if you get online, you can find as many articles against high fat, ketosis based eating as you can for it. Right. And these are all people that are well-meaning, who are just, basically saying, hey, this is the way to do it. And I think people, for some reason, they want to have the right way, People get invested, right? People get invested and they build a personality and a brand around one way of doing things. And it's normal to do that, right? It's normal to say, hey, this is what I'm doing, especially if you're getting work from it, and if you're getting, mm-hmm. If it's your livelihood, it's part of your livelihood, as it is for both Ben and Rich.
Yeah.
So, luckily at this point, that's not my livelihood. So I have a little different approach.
No, it's a really interesting point of view. And I'm definitely... I'm currently more in the high fat camp, but it's probably bad that I haven't necessarily, took Rich's books and read his articles and kind of like or looked at this, like you said, interpreted the literature that's for the vegan side of things. And I really should probably open my mind more on that, so I can have perhaps a more broader view like yourself.
But the one thing I just want to mention is, if my thought is, if it works for you,
yeah,
right, then that's really the starting and the ending point, right? So if you're having success, and so Ben's offering this idea, and he's going to reach a lot of people, and if they take this idea and it works for them, then he has effectively had this really positive impact on their lives, right? And so there's nothing wrong with finding something that works for you, right? And just going with it. The only issue I have is when the high fat guy tells the vegan guy, hey, you're doing it wrong, and the vegan guy tells the high fat guy, hey, no, you're doing it wrong, and they're both wildly successful in their pursuits. What? You're just, how does either one of them have it wrong?
Yeah.
It's a question of values, and people have different values. So, yeah.
I love how you talked about Pareto law then, and how I've never thought about applying that to diet. So just to summarize that then. So am I right in my interpretation of what you said just earlier was that if you apply the Pareto law to diet, it's like, well, they all say, so the 80% is they're all saying, don't eat all these processed foods. So you want to make sure that kind of 80% of the time. Actually, no, I'm completely going off track here. So, do you do me a favor? Would you kind of talk about what your kind of conclusions? Yeah, using a Pareto law.
It's more of, if I look at Ben Greenfield's approach, right? So 80% of the effectiveness of that diet, right? So most of the effectiveness of that diet comes from 20% of the rules or the dogma or whatever, right? And 80% of the vegan diet comes from 20% of what it says. 80% of the paleo diet, which is super popular, at least in the States right now, I know, comes from 20% of the dogma. And if you look closely enough, my assumption is that the 20% is going to have a heap of overlap.
Right. Yeah.
Because all of these diets, you've got the paleo guys, you've got the ketosis guys, you've got the vegans, you've got all of these people, and the top folks that are pushing these diets, they're all people that we want to emulate, right? And so the very fact that they're all successful, even though they're eating vastly different diets, the obvious conclusion to me is that where's the commonality? Because that's really where the most, and obviously some people are different, right? I mean, there are some people that benefit more from a high-fat diet because of they're diabetic or whatever it is. But so that's my application of kind of the Pareto principle is you've got, because the Pareto principle to me, it says 80% of the effect comes from 20% of the causes, right? So 80% of the diet's effect comes from 20% of the causes, which is the rules or the way you're supposed to eat. So.
Yeah, okay, cool. So I know I'm just interpreting that even further. So I think that 20% is kind of like, you could say, well, they all advocate fruits and vegetables, high quality fruits and vegetables, and they all advocate get away from processed junk food. So it's like done, right? Whole food, fruits and vegetables, you're okay.
Right. And so the fact that, some of the stuff that doesn't make sense is, when one of them says, all right, don't eat grapefruit, right? That's one of the, that's one of the pieces that don't really matter, because if you're eating the fruits and vegetables and you have an occasional grapefruit, you're still getting most of the benefit. Yeah. Right. It's not like because a lot of these diets, they have to write books about it, right? So the books are hundreds of pages long. So it's you can't really sell a book. And I sound kind of cynical, and I'm not really that cynical, but the best nutritionist, my favorite nutritionist, is Michael Pollan, because he's the only one I've seen recently that really recognizes the challenges of nutritional science and the incredible complexity of the human body, that we cannot simply, do a study with 20 people and actually have something that we can apply to the whole population. It doesn't work. And, he's the guy that I like, because he has those 3 rules. Eat, I can't remember what they are. Something like eat less. I can't remember. Something about eating plants. If you can't remember,
email over to me and we'll put it in the show notes.
Yeah.
Or something.
Yeah. I think he said eat food, not too much, mostly plants. That's what it is. Eat food.
I like that.
Not too much, mostly plants.
Yeah.
And that's that 20% of the wisdom, right? Yeah. If you follow those rules, if you really follow those rules, then you're gonna be sweet.
Yeah, that's very much echoing what Skylar Tanner said actually in our first interview, which I know you found me through his stuff. So check out those interviews, because I think you'd really enjoy that.
All right, yeah.
Okay, cool. So talking more about because obviously you're a fascinating guy. You've done these incredible races and performances, which are just unbelievable to me. Because I am really far at the other end of the spectrum. So I do high intensity strength training once a week, the Big Five approach.
Yep.
Well, I do kind of like a split version of that, and I play basketball. So that's kind of my exercise. But I don't. I do a race called Survival of the Fittest, which is like a 10K in the UK with obstacles, and I do that once a year. I'm not doing it this year, but I have done it for like the last 4 or 5 years. But I'm not I'm not one of these like guys that's into like the real long extreme endurance type stuff. Now, I have a few listeners who are absolutely, I know they'd be fascinated by me asking this question. So tell us, what is the hardest event you've ever done? And tell us about that.
Okay. So I'm going to turn that into 2 questions. I'll tell you about the hardest event I've ever done, and then I'll tell you about the hardest thing I've ever done, because they're not the same. I would probably have to say, boy, that is a tough question. I think the hardest event I've ever done would have to be Primal Quest, and only because it was the first really long format adventure race that I've ever done. And so it's a 10-day adventure race, and it was in Moab, Utah, which in July. So it was baking, and I was living in New Zealand at the time, so I was training in winter in New Zealand for an event where the daytime temperatures are 40 Celsius, or so it was pretty epic. And I remember thinking, I think that it started out with a 42 mile desert trek, and so we're 30 miles into this desert trek, and I had gotten a pair of shoes from a sponsor that my brother brought out the day before the race. And 30 miles into this trek, I have silver dollar sized blisters all over my feet. And we're 8 hours or 6 hours into the race, and I'm just looking ahead at this 10 days of absolute agony, because every step is now painful, and I'm thinking, what am I going to do? And it was just, it was an absolute low right off the bat in that race. Just been walking through the desert, would just run out of water. My feet are just, because there's sand in my shoes, which didn't help, and so I was ready to drop out. And my brother, because he'd lost a team member, which is why I was at that race, he'd flown me over there from New Zealand and paid for my ticket and the entry fee and everything. So he put out $3,000 for me to come and race with him. And so I just felt so bad, but I just didn't want to be there at all. And we got to a transition area. And actually, we got to a bike. We got through the run or the foot section, and we got to a bike leg. And so my feet recovered a little bit on the bike. And then we got to the next transition, and I had to put back on my shoes. And I put back on my shoes, and my blisters were still there. And I just was ready to throw in the towel. But we had put in our bin, our transition bin, which is where you get to put extra clothes and food and stuff. We put flip flops. And so I took off my shoes, and I wore flip flops for the next 7 days of the race. And it was, I was running through, at this point we honestly weren't doing much running. It was more like, trekking and stuff like that. But we did a bit of running through canyons, slot canyons, all this kind of stuff, up on real gnarly terrain, rim rock terrain up in the area. And my feet completely healed. They just dried out and the blisters went away. And it was awesome. I was able to put shoes on for a couple of big mountain stages towards the end of the race. Wow. But that race was just, I was tired all the time. It's my first real experience with full-on hallucinations. There was an 15-mile trek through some canyons that I don't remember at all.
No
completely. So about 4 hours that I just gone, and it's interesting because I've since read about that, and it's almost like hypnotism, right? Where you have the stem of your brain can actually navigate simple obstacles and things like that, and keep you on the trail and keep you on your feet. Whereas the frontal cortex is just checked out. It's like, I'm out of here. I can't take this anymore. It was fascinating. It was a trip, and it was just really. I got so sick after that because my immune system was just through the floor. And we had to postpone our trip back to New Zealand because I couldn't get on the plane. I went to the doctor, and the doctor asked if I had AIDS because I'd lost so much weight. And he took me to a room, away from my wife and stuff, and say, I'm just going to ask you this in private. And, I was like, no, really, I've just been doing a race. He just couldn't believe it. It's like, why does anybody do this? So yeah, it was, and then I came back to New Zealand, was sick for another 2 weeks, just throwing up. My body was just hammered after that. Yeah. So that's the hardest race I've done. But then there's quite a few things that leading up to racing, where when I was doing adventures, climbing and stuff, where I learned to have quite a bit of confidence. I remember a climb where, I was on the sheer rock face and belaying my partner over, and there was no gear in the rock, and so if he slipped, he was going to pull us both off the mountain, and that we were dead. And I just sitting there and just thinking, just counting the meters of rope that I pulled in, and not telling him anything because I didn't want him to worry. So there's a couple situations like that. I kayaked once to Catalina Island.
Sorry, just
LA,
how high up on that mountain were you? Sorry, just to.
Oh, it was probably about a 2,000-foot climb, and we were about halfway up. So we were probably 1,000 feet off the ground.
Wow.
Yeah, and it just, there wasn't, normally when rock climbing, you're putting gear in the rock that will protect you in the case of a fall. You'll still fall, but it'll catch you. And on this particular pitch, it was a traverse sideways. So I was basically sideways, and there was a little handrail, which meant there was like a lip of rock that you're just traversing your hands over, and there weren't really any feet. And there's no gear that I could put in. And so I just got to a little ledge, and the ledge it was just covered in loose rubble, and there was no place to put gear in there.
Gosh.
So I'm just sitting. It was one of these times where, and I remember writing about it after my journal, that if there were a button I could have pushed, and I could have lost everything, lost all my climbing gear, and never climbed again. And this is the passion of my life at the time. I had hit it. Man, I was just. It was, but.
Joe, you cut out there a second, Andy. The internet cut out. What did you said about pushing a button? But could you repeat that?
Oh yeah, it was one of those moments where if there had been a button that I could push, where I was giving up everything to be out of the situation, give up, never climb again, give up all my thousands of dollars worth of climbing gear, I'd have pushed it because I was just, I was so scared, and but I just, there's nothing, and there isn't a button, right? And so that was one of my first experiences with realizing, there's not a button, and you get yourself into the situation. There's only one way out, and you're part of it. And I've called upon that moment a lot, and similar experiences that I've had to that are one of the things that I credit to my success in endurance sports just from the get-go, is that none of the times I've been in endurance sports or big races have I ever looked for that button. So they've all been, I don't want to be here, but I wouldn't give up everything to be out of here, kind of a thing.
Right, that's awesome. You were talking about kayaking. You started talking about that,
yeah. There was another trip that I was wanting some adventure, and my brother and I decided, we were living in different places, to kayak to Catalina, which is about 30 miles, 25 miles something across the open ocean from California, from the coast of California out to this island. And we just rented a kayak from a sports store, an open kayak, so it was like a lake boat, stay close to shore and stuff, and threw some sleeping bags and some garbage sacks and put on some holey wetsuits and paddled out there. And it was we didn't know it, but it was a small craft advisory that day. And we didn't have a weather radio. We didn't have an emergency radio. And so we're out, in the middle of the ocean, 12 miles from the island and 12 miles from the land. And it doesn't look like the island's getting any closer. And the waves are so big, they're constantly coming up into the boat. And so we had a little bilge pump, and one of us had to full time be pumping the bilge. And the other one was just trying to keep the nose into the waves so that we wouldn't capsize, because they were big enough that they'd have capsized us. Somehow we made it, Somehow we made it to the island. But it was one of those times where you realize you've gone completely over your head, but there's no way to get out unless you just keep going, And so those sorts of experiences, and that's why, when you asked that mental question earlier, I don't know how to. I mean, I'm lucky because my formative years, completely unrelated to endurance sports, gave me these mental attributes that, in my mind, are crucial for success in endurance sports. Obviously, people get there different ways, but that's how I got there, basically, without ever doing a race. So,
have you read The Rise of Superman by Stephen Cutler?
I have not, but that has been recommended to me a number of times.
Yeah, your story is because he talks about how extreme, how basically, the regular person can learn from how extreme athletes get into the zone. And I feel like your story should be in that book, or some of your stories. I definitely recommend that read. It's a good book. I have a question from a very close friend of mine, Stuart Ralph. He asked me, I think you kind of answered this, but I'll let you be the judge of that.
Sure.
He said, what was the scariest thing you've done and how did you push through it? I don't know if that's the mountain climbing story you just gave. Is there anything else you could add to answer that?
Yeah, that's probably excuse me. I've had a number of experiences like that. Those are the ones that are coming to mind right now. All the climbing. It's basically a decade since I've done that kind of climbing. But I probably have 24 stories that are similar to that, getting myself in situations where we thought something was a good idea and it turned out not to be, and you push through. Done a lot of different things, so I've developed these abilities not just in climbing, but I've since become a paddler, a pack rafter, and gotten way in over my head on that. And I don't do that anymore because I have kids. And so and it's actually been a great fit because the endurance racing came right at a time where I needed more of a margin of safety because I had a family, I had kids, and I didn't, but I still wanted to suffer. I would guess that up on the mountain was probably the scariest. I've had lots of injuries. I've taken falls climbing, and broken bones and things, but I was never quite as scared as that time, sitting on that ledge, counting in the meters of rope, just thinking this is it. Yeah.
Jesus. Okay, so again, this might be one you've kind of answered in a way, but so this is Elliot Myers. He asks, what drives you to carry on when your body can't give any more?
Okay, so that's kind of I've never been in the position. So this goes back to my belief in the central governor, that my body can never give anymore, right? I found myself in the position where my mind doesn't want to give anymore, right? So and there are a couple things that I regularly do, and I talk somewhat about these in my book when I talk about the mental tactics, but it's this idea that you have to become familiar with lows, and so you'll reach a low if you're doing a long race where you're coming up, you're having this conversation with your central governor and you're believing that you just should quit. Like you're not strong enough, you're not fit enough, you should have trained harder. The niggling in your Achilles or whatever it is a good sign to stop. You're coming with all these reasons that you should stop, that you should give up, or that you should quit. So one thing I never do, and I've gotten really good at, is I never listen. I always say an hour. If I feel like that, I say, all right. I look at my watch and I say, all right, I'm starting the time right now. I give myself another hour. And if I haven't felt, and I don't always feel a lot better after the end of an hour, right? It's almost like by that quiets down the central government. I look at the watch and say, all right, in an hour you win, let's shut up and let's just focus on the next hour and just carry it on.
Right.
Right. And almost invariably, I get through that next hour and I'm like, oh, that actually wasn't that bad. It's been an hour already, kind of a thing.
Yeah.
So not really about the physical limitations. It's much more about the mental ones. And the mental ones are the tough ones to overcome anyway. But the other thing is, and I for me, this is why I like to suffer. And I thought about this recently in terms of both my high intensity training, which is very suffer filled, and then longer events, is that what it does for me is it enables me to be content and actually just really happy and full of joy in my regular life. Like I don't take anything for granted, or I start to take stuff for granted when it's been too long between my last effort. But it's it's really awesome for me, because now I come home, and the fact that I'm living in a dumpy little cottage and I don't have power and I'm looking for work in a new country, that stuff doesn't bother me at all, right?
Yeah.
I'm like, this is great. I'm just hanging out with my kids. I'm healthy, and I'm sorry. And I mean, it's a strange way to think of it, but I think that it goes back to that question about how some people get it and some people don't. I don't think that makes any sense to a lot of people, but for some people that want to push themselves, whether it's through adventuring or racing or whatever, there's something to be said for taking yourself out of your comfort zone. And for me, man, I like to dig deep. The questions I like to answer are, can you do this? Right? Can you keep going? So that's when I get to those places, I actually relish that in a strange sort of way, because I know, all right, this is where I'm asking this question now.
Cool.
Can I do this? Yeah.
And for anyone listening, I thoroughly recommend you purchase Andy's book, which I raved about at the start of this, because I think you really go into it in the book, the mindset side of things, and how to really push through. When is your next event, and what does your training regime look like for that?
So right now I'm in a bit of a maintenance phase. So right now I do 2 5-minute sessions a week, and then about a 3-minute strength training. So right now I'm about 15 minutes a week. My next event is going to be a through run of the Dusky Track, which is a 88-kilometer. And you could find that the Dusky Track is a great. You can link to that, because it's normally a 9-day walk in Fiordland, New Zealand, and it's just this epic trail. It's a very challenging trail over 9 days, and so I've got a guy that's been keen to do it in a day, and so we're going to go give it a go. I'm going back to the States for 3 weeks, and then it'll happen probably sometime in October. Is my goal.
Sounds pleasant.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay.
So.
Sorry, go on. No, sorry, I cut you off there. What were you going to say?
No, I was just saying, so right now I'm more focused on these individual pursuits, just because it's in trying to make a start in a new place. So racing is expensive. Yeah. So I can have just about as much fun at this point. Yeah, just doing big efforts on my own. So
cool. What health and fitness books do you most recommend to people?
Wow. The Body by Science one, I'm a huge fan of science. I think that there's not enough. So that is definitely one of my favorites as well, even though I haven't got through the whole thing. There's one of the first ones that I read was Joe Friel's Triathlon's Training Bible.
Okay.
Which I got a lot of stuff out of. But what was interesting, when I was trying to follow that program, like I was looking at it, it tells you training hours based upon what level of stuff you were going to train for. And I was following the junior triathlete program, because I was only doing 2.5 hours a week. And that was the recommend for like the 12 and 13-year-old triathletes. But that's all I could imagine doing. I mean, some of these, I couldn't imagine doing 15 hours. But I just learned a lot in terms of cadence and efficiency. So that's really what I got most out of that book. Honestly, a lot of what I've been reading lately have been, other blogs, and it's tough because of the position I'm in terms of what I'm trying to do. I haven't found a lot of traditional training books that have offered what I was looking to get out of them, other than McGuff's book. So a lot of what I do is look for, do a lot of research, look for scholarly articles on stuff, and then build my own plan based on that. And then
that's probably the best way to go. Question. So, just probably asking for your little bit of your advice, really, is I'm probably going to run that Survival of the Fittest race next year, which is basically a 12-kilometer race. Yep. With just obstacles. So it's a walk in the park compared to a lot of what you do. If you were me, how would you prepare for that? I mean, I know a lot of these kind of routine, the kind of workouts are in your book, but if you knew that, okay, so it's 12K, and there's probably one or two obstacles every kilometer. When I say obstacles, like walls and tunnels you got to go through, and like lakes and that kind of thing. Well, what would you do to prepare for that, for a top form?
I put on a race just like that the last couple of years I was in the States, so I'm very familiar with what you're talking about.
Cool.
So, I would definitely work on your speed. So there was actually a guy that I was training for a while who ended up winning the race that I put on, not because I gave him secrets, but he was a fit guy anyway. But so one of the things that he was doing, and I also did for a while, would be, and it's brutal, but if you have a track, you got a 400-meter track or something like that, so you do sprints around the track. And every time you finish a lap, you do... you either do 10 chins or 15 push-ups or whatever you meet out, and you do this for a mile. So you're basically running 4 laps, and you're working. And we used to challenge each other and try to get the times down. And it's a great, I would definitely recommend that, because if you're going to be able to push after climbing a wall or going across a set of monkey bars or doing anything like that, right? As soon as you start using, as soon as you get beyond just that aerobic and you start using your upper body muscles, it will feel awful, right? I don't know if when you did it before, if you were really pushing, but to be able to deal with that and to understand how that feels and have that ability to just sprint and then do something quickly. So you could, I don't know if you've got the capability of having, of going to a park. I mean, parks are great if you don't have a track. If you have a park, then you can create obstacles at the park. You can create you can do belly crawls, or you can do monkey bars, or you can go up over walls or things like that. But do it in conjunction every 400 meters or so. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So you cut out a little bit there. So it's like go to the park, kind of spin around the park, and then just basically put in some kind of obstacle or something that's going to really, I guess, use your upper body strength every so often.
Well, yeah, and really you focus on the speed. Get a goal time in mind, so you're just hammering it for the 400s, and it'll hurt bad, because you'll get the blood will go to your upper body. Do 10 push-ups or something, and when you start running, it won't be in your legs. It'll be tough.
Yeah. Gotcha. You're really still recovering from your last race, aren't you?
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so let's close up there. So what is the best way for people to contact you, Andy, and find out more about you?
You can they can email me at just ultramentalbook@gmail.com.
Cool.
Sorry, my throat's getting a little dry. Yeah.
No worries. I've asked a lot of you because no,
it's been great.
Yeah,
great.
No, likewise. I've really enjoyed this, and I've learned a ton actually. So yeah, I'll make sure all your stuff, your website, your resources, email, etc., was all in the show notes. And hopefully maybe some point we'll do a part 2. But thanks very much for your time this evening. I really appreciate it.
Hey, thanks so much, Lawrence. I really appreciate it and giving me the opportunity.
No, you're welcome, Andy. Talk to you soon. Take care. Recover well.
Yeah.
Bye.
Yeah, thanks.
This podcast is brought to you by hituni.com, hituni.com, the best website for online personal training courses for high intensity training. So whether you want to become a top level high intensity training trainer, or you want to maximize your knowledge on the subject of high intensity training to optimize your results, check out hituni.com. Add your desired course to cart and simply add the coupon code CW10 and you'll get a 10% discount. Thanks for your support.